welcome to Discovering the Law. My name is Rivera, and I am your host for today. Today, we want to thank the law firm, prestigious law firm in Boston, of McClennen and Fish, for lending us one of her greatest assets, attorney Mary Ryan. She's a partner at McClennen and Fish, and she is the chairwoman of the American Bar Association Committee on Public Service and Pro Bono. Attorney Ryan, thank you for coming today.
Lucy, thank you so much for inviting me and for your very kind introduction.
Please tell us about your very interesting background.
Well, I don't know exactly how interesting it is, but since this is a Boston TV show, I'm very proud to say I'm a native Bostonian. I was born and brought up in South Boston, and so oddly enough, my law firm is now in the Seaport District. So I'm practicing law on B Street in South Boston. It's been a long way back. I went to school here in Boston, and after a couple of years after college, I decided I wanted to go back and get some further education and training. A number of people suggested law school to me, and it's been terrific. I've been extremely fortunate in having the luck to have a great legal career at a great firm.
And how long have you been at the firm?
I've been at the firm since 1980, so it's my 36th year.
And what has been the change for women in the law that you have seen for all these years?
Oh, tremendous, tremendous change. When I was in law school, a third of my class were women. And so a lot of us thought that there wouldn't be that many challenges to being a women lawyer. But when I graduated, I found out that even though women were going to law school in great numbers, they weren't necessarily in the profession yet in great numbers, and particularly at senior levels. Things have changed tremendously in the time that I've been practicing. It's very rare now that I would be the only woman in a courtroom or the only woman in a meeting or anything like that. And women have just ascended the ranks in so many different areas of our profession. If you think about the Attorney General's office, we've had two successive women Attorney Generals in Martha Coakley and Maura Healey. Some of this is because women in the profession early on realized that they needed to address some issues that were particular to their concerns and their advancement. I'm pleased to say that I'm a past president of the Women's Bar Association. There's a terrific group of women who have led that organization and participated in it over the years. And we've worked on a number of issues. So at any rate, it has changed tremendously and for the better. There are still challenges. There are some glass ceilings. Women in some segments of the profession, such as private law firms, aren't always represented at the highest levels as we'd like to see. But all in all, things have just changed tremendously.
Thank you, Attorney Ryan. What kind of work do you do at McClennen?
Well, when I came out of law school and started practicing, a lot of environmental laws had just been passed and were being enacted. So I quickly became involved in Superfund litigation. That's the federal law, and now we have a state law too that deals with how you address the legacy of contamination from past manufacturing practices or other historical disposal. So it's turned out to be a very challenging and interesting field. You deal with interesting legal questions. Many of the laws were new, and we were developing the law as we practiced in the 80s. The science is very interesting. But I think one of the most important things is this matters to people in the community. How you clean up a site, what the concern, addressing the public concerns. Another area, say land use and development, involves environmental considerations too, on how you protect the environment while developing property.
And you mentioned just now that you were the past president of the of the Boston Bar Association and also the Women's Bar Association. What is a bar association?
A bar association is much more than a trade group of lawyers. It's an association of lawyers that are dedicated and come together for a couple of reasons. One is professional development. And like any professional group, there's continuing legal education. You get an opportunity to research and write on topics and submit for publication. But another important aspect, besides networking and meeting your peers, is the opportunity to give back to the community, to do public service. And that's something in particular, as you know, that I'd like to talk about tonight, particularly in connection with my role as chair of the ABA's Pro Bono and Public Service Committee.
Yes, and please tell us about the pro bono work that you do with the American Bar Association?
Well, what I'm particularly involved in is one of the ways in which lawyers try to improve the legal system so that every one of our citizens, everyone who lives in this country can have access to the legal system. Because one of the things that is important to understand, I think everyone knows from watching TV that if you get arrested, if you can't afford a lawyer, you'll get a lawyer. But the fact of the matter is that's not how it works on this, what we call the civil side of the court or the civil legal system. So take, for example, in an eviction case, if you're being evicted, you don't necessarily, you don't have a right to a lawyer. And what if you don't understand the law? What if you have language problems? What if you have an illness that prevents you from adequately representing yourself? You're at a significant disadvantage. 90% of the tenants who appear in eviction cases don't have a lawyer. Some of the landlords don't have a lawyer either, but the table is tilted in favor of the landlords when you realize that you're dealing with a legal system that was designed to have each party represented by a trained advocate. So that's the fundamental issue that many, many people are trying to come to terms with, is how do you take a legal system that was designed thinking there would be lawyers on both sides and adapt it to the modern situation where we know people are going to court all the time without lawyers. So there's three ways that lawyers can help with that. One is through pro bono work. Now, pro bono is a Latin phrase that stands for the public good. And basically, it's very simple. It means that a lawyer gives back to the community by using our particular legal skills and talents to help people who can't afford a lawyer. Mostly it's individuals who are low income. Sometimes it will be a group. I mean, for example, my law firm represented a class of children who were seeking to reform the Department of Children and Families, some of their practices, because they thought they needed improvement. And I won't necessarily get into that topic, but we know that that's a continuing cause of concern in Massachusetts. But in terms of representing individuals, that's one of the ways that lawyers do it. Now, other things that lawyers can do involve trying to change the legal system, and I'm going to talk more about that. And I also want to talk a little bit more about, or I'll just mention in passing, that one of the things lawyers can do is donate to civil legal aid and support legislative funding for civil legal aid. In Massachusetts, the legislature this year increased funding for civil legal aid to $17 million. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. In fact, that's only a third of the civil legal aid budget. But I guess I also need to stop for a moment and talk about what civil legal aid is. And that's one of the ways that we help people who can't afford to access the legal system. So civil legal aid are things like Greater Boston Legal Services, and they provide lawyers to people that are at the very bottom of our society in terms of income. The guidelines are generally around 125% of federal poverty guidelines. That's only like $17,000 for an individual, maybe $30,000 for a family of 4. But they can help people with their legal problems and give them a lawyer. The problem is there isn't enough money to do that for everyone. There was a study by the Boston Bar Association 2 years ago that found, and I think actually it was released only a year ago, that found they turned away 64% of the people that came to them for help. So what happens to those other 64%? That's where the private bar comes in part, and we can take cases directly. I've represented people in eviction cases, and I hope to have a chance to talk to you more about some of the immigration work that a lot of the bar is doing now. But in addition to doing that, we're trying to develop ways in which the lawyers can do what we call limited assistance representation, short for LAR. The state courts have adopted rules that permit lawyers to be hired to do only one part of a case. So if you're in the middle of a divorce and there's a fight over a house, for example, or there's a custody battle, and the rest of it's routine, then it's okay now. You can go out and hire a lawyer to just do that one part. But even more importantly, lawyers can now volunteer. For example, in the housing court on Thursday mornings, if you go there, there's a table, and there's a lawyer there that will answer questions for the tenants. and there's a lawyer there that will answer questions for landlords. Or in the probate and family court, if you go in on a divorce case and you don't have a lawyer, there's a lawyer for the day there. And that's one important way that lawyers can help. I'm sure I'm raving on too much, Lucy.
No, it's important to hear about that. Also, tell us about the other agencies that provide legal services in Boston, like Greater Boston Legal Services Volunteer Lawyers Project.
Well, the Greater Boston Legal Services falls into the category of civil legal aid providers, and they do a tremendous job, but again, have limited resources. Volunteer Lawyers Project is a federally funded agency, and they primarily work with people who are in private practice who are willing to take cases. Last year, they did, I think, they had approximately 1,000 lawyers on their panel, lawyers and paralegals who would help people, and generated a tremendous number of pro bono hours.
Yes, so the Gideon versus Wainwright case that gives the right to counsel to those accused of crime. Please talk to us about that in terms of the legal civil system in Massachusetts.
I will. And this comes back to the fundamental point that I mentioned earlier, that on the civil side of the court, there is no right to counsel. So everyone knows, as I said, everyone knows from the TV shows. So there is a campaign going on in this country, and it's very active here in Massachusetts, to create a civil right to counsel. Because everything else we're doing is a way to help people short of having a lawyer. And sometimes that's really important. I didn't mention, for example, all the self-help centers that the courts have developed. And let me digress for a minute back to that before I go on to talk about the evolution of a civil right to counsel. But another thing that lawyers help with is we've lobbied for the creation, and the courts have been extremely responsive to this, of self-help centers in, for example, the Brook Courthouse. There's one also out in Franklin County. And that's a place, Brook Courthouse is where the housing court is, it's where the probate and family court is, the Boston Municipal Court. So for example, if you were being sued on a debt, you might end up in the Boston Municipal Court. And you can now go, and there are court personnel that will answer questions for you. So the hope is that between having that self-help center and having the assistance of a lawyer for the day, which is one of the projects that VLP does, that you will be able to navigate the system on your own. But the fact of the matter, and there are legal websites too. I think there's one called Find Legal Resources or Legal Resources Finder. There's masshelp.org, masslegalhelp.org. There are places like that where you can go. But at the end of the day, for many people, if they don't have their own advocate, they may have legal rights that they can't vindicate. And so that's been recognized. For example, if you're a parent and the state is trying to terminate your parental rights, Massachusetts has already recognized that there will be a right to counsel at state expense. The court will appoint someone for you. Another example is guardianship cases where, because you can lose some very important rights in terms of your relationship with your child. And so our state Supreme Court recently held that they will require appointment of counsel in those cases. But it's still just a small portion of cases. As I said, no right to counsel in eviction cases, no right to counsel if you're losing important benefits, no right to counsel if you could lose your child in a custody case. And so many people believe there should be a civil right to counsel. It can't be universal. There's too many cases on the civil side. But when it comes to fundamental human rights, like custody, like shelter, like freedom from abuse, that the government should step in and help out here. So one of the things the Boston Bar Association did was, following a resolution by the American Bar Association encouraging states to create a civil right to counsel, the Boston Bar appointed a civil right to counsel task force. We work collectively with the Mass Bar Association, many other stakeholders in the community, and we recommended and performed a series of pilot studies. One, for example, was conducted down in the Quincy District Court, where Judge Mark Coven is the presiding justice. We had the pro bono services of a law professor at Harvard who also has a PhD in statistics. And at the end of that project, it was determined that based on a random analysis, if you had a lawyer, you had twice as good a chance of keeping your house or negotiating an agreement that would maybe lead to a forgiveness of rent because the landlord, in fact, might not be entitled to that higher rent if the conditions hadn't lived up to the lease. You needed a little bit more time. The end result, though, was that people stayed housed, either kept their own house or had an opportunity to avoid going into a shelter. And that's fundamentally something that all of us want. We want to keep our homes. And if we have to move, if the rent's too high and you know you really can't afford it, you need time to do that. And having a lawyer just makes all the difference in the world. We received funding from the Attorney General's Office Home Court program, funded out of some of the foreclosure litigation, which resulted in awards to the state, to conduct similar research out in Framingham and Worcester. And again, the same results. It is clear that sometimes having a lawyer, to me it's absolute obvious, but now we have evidence that if you have a lawyer, it can make a difference. Now, what else do we know? We know that if, for example, in the case of an eviction, you lose your house, you're going to avail yourself of other public benefits, and it's going to cost the state as much or more. The Boston Bar Association did a study that was released last year. It's the same study I referenced before that showed the state can save $2 to $5 for every dollar it spends on either increasing civil legal aid from staff attorneys like those at Greater Boston Legal Services, or creating a right to counsel, as I am advocating for and many other people in the state are advocating for. And we need the public, I really hope the public can understand that this is about lawyers trying to make sure that people are protected in the legal system. But I think we'll hear more and more about a civil right to counsel, not universally, but in particular kinds of cases.
Great. For our viewers today, this episode will be viewed online at www.discoveringthelaw.com, because our guest today is Mary Ryan. She's an attorney and partner at the law firm of McClennen and Fish. Attorney Ryan, another important piece of work that you do with the American Bar Association, in addition to the fundamentally important work that you're doing with the civil work, is the unaccompanied minors.
It is, Lucy, and I am just very involved in that right now. I think most of your audience and yourself will remember that last summer we kept reading headline after headline that children were surging across the border from Central America, from the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. They were coming across the border. They were being detained. They went through terrible journeys to get here. The leadership of the American Bar Association had the opportunity to go to Texas. They met with some of the children. They observed the conditions at the border. And they made a promise to America that they would use the power of the American Bar Association to make sure that these children had a better journey through our court system than they had coming to this country. And I was fortunate enough, as chair of the Pro Bono Committee, to be asked to co-chair a working group that we've formed on this. And our major objective is to find attorneys to represent these children in the immigration courts and in state courts. And I'll talk about that in a moment also. Because here are some of the numbers. 68,000 children came across the border last year. The numbers are down this year, but there are still 40,000 cases in the immigration system that are being processed, and that's not even necessarily all of the children. Some of the children's cases haven't even been put into the system yet. The vast majority of those children are not represented by counsel, and when they are not represented by counsel, their chances of success are only a fifth of what they would be if they represented. I think the numbers may have changed recently as more cases go through the system, but numbers that I saw in the spring of this year said that if a child had a lawyer, the child had a 73% chance of success. Without a lawyer, it was only a 15% chance of success. And we're talking about children, most of whom have a right to stay in the country. Now, there's two, I'm not an immigration expert by any means, but I've had a great education from people who are. And the children, some of them can claim asylum, but some of them also can claim what's called special immigrant juvenile status. It's a law that was passed a number of years ago having to do with protecting victims of trafficking. But under this special immigrant juvenile status, the courts recognized that if a child had been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one parent, then it might be in their best interest to stay in this country rather than return to their country of origin. Congress also decided that those findings would be made in the state courts because that's what our state probate and family courts and our juvenile courts do all the time. So to get that kind of relief, the child has to go to state court. But if you can imagine, if you were a child of 12, you didn't speak English that well, how would you possibly know what to do? It's very easy, I think, for everyone to understand that children like this need a lawyer. And one of the things that I think you and I as lawyers are committed to is making sure that if someone has a legal right, it's vindicated. You might not always win these cases, but it's important for our legal system that people's rights be presented and protected. It also helps the courts. They have a hard time processing these cases, and they want lawyer assistance also. So one of the messages that I'd like to communicate to your audience is there is a network of pro bono providers here in Boston, across the country, but of course we're focused here in Boston. There's a long list that I could give you. One of the agencies that I'm working with is an agency called KIND. It stands for Kids in Need of Defense. And they take pro bono volunteer lawyers like myself and many of the other lawyers in my firm and in firms across the city and match them up with children who need a lawyer. And in that one way, we're able to make a difference. Another great program is the Political Asylum and Immigration and Refugee Program. They primarily work on asylum cases, but also do SIJS cases. So there is help out there. To the extent we can't get enough lawyers, that's my job this year, is working with the ABA to try to get more lawyers to be able to meet that challenge.
Attorney Ryan, the work is commendable, it's hard, and even though we have run out of time, please tell us, what would you say women that want to go into legal field?
Good question. I would encourage anyone to become a lawyer. It's a tremendous field. It's open. If you don't know, I will tell you that right now the job market is particularly challenging. There are a lot of lawyers. There's been somewhat of a decrease in demand. My major advice to you would be think carefully about what kind of job you want once you get through law school, because there's many, many opportunities. You can go into the public sector, you can go into government, you can go into private practice. Private practice, like many corporations, like many corporate type employers, can be very demanding. It's rewarding but demanding. So go into it with your eyes wide open.
We want to thank the law firm of Nutter, McClennen and Fish for allowing us to put Attorney Ryan to talk about the extremely important work she's doing, and a call to all lawyers to help. This episode of Discovering the Law will be viewed at www.discoveringthelaw.com. My name is Lucy Rivera, and I've been your host today. Thank you for watching.